Our story begins in the 1820s in Nagujawanong, now known as Peterborough County. Long before Europeans were surveying the area and clearing it for agriculture, it was the traditional hunting and fishing grounds of the Mississauga and Anishinaabe. Relationships between the Mississauga and other First Nations were often negotiated through treaties.
This form of diplomacy continued to be used as early Europeans and First Nations negotiated where and how settlers could use the land. The Royal Proclamation of 1763, a treaty initiated by the British Crown, stated that lands west of established colonies would remain Indigenous grounds and were off-limits to settlement. These areas could only be acquired through treaties between the Crown and Indigenous peoples. Treaty 20, also known as the Rice Lake Purchase, was signed at present-day Port Hope in 1818. It enabled the settlement of over 1 million acres, including Peterborough County. In exchange, the government was supposed to pay in goods to every man, woman, and child, about $9 per person at this time. These were listed as 2 blankets, cloth for 1 coat, 1 pair of trousers, 2 shirts, several small articles besides a gun, ammunition, kettles, and other items.
Prior to colonization in the Peterborough area, the Mississauga would have enjoyed a relatively traditional way of life. In the early 1820s, the Mississauga began adopting an additional spiritual political outlook brought to them by the New England Company and Methodist teachings. The first mission house in Peterborough County was built at Rice Lake, present-day Hiawatha First Nation. This Methodist church would later become Hiawatha United. Later, in the 1820s, an area along the north shore of Rice Lake was officially designated as a reserve under the name of the Mississaugas of Rice Lake Reserve. 22 homes were built near the banks of the lake. A square for public buildings was left in the middle. The village also boasted a store and post office, a schoolhouse, and teachers' residence. The Mississauga around Mud Lake settled on a reserve in 1830 in an area now known as Curve Lake First Nation. Prior to colonization, the Mississauga would not have lived in traditional villages. They followed a transient lifestyle, traversing well-developed trails from one camp to the next. A wigwam, or roundhouse, would have been a traditional dwelling constructed from bent saplings and bark from various trees such as birch, cedar, hickory, and basswood, and it would have been designed to accommodate a multi-generational family unit. Manoman, or wild rice, is a sacred food for the Anishinaabe and was a crucial form of sustenance long before the Trent Severn waterway flooded wetlands used for harvesting the rice. A camp like this might have also included a garden with traditional healing medicines like sweetgrass, sage, tobacco, and cedar. One of the ways the Mississauga manipulated the landscape was through planned burning. These controlled burns promoted the growth of their medicines and renewed growth. It would only be a decade before the first residential school, the Mohawk Institute in Brantford, was established. Members of the reserves at Mud Lake and Rice Lake began attending the residential schools in the 1840s. Though members were initially interested in sending their children, this soon changed as word spread of strict assimilation and abuse.
Meanwhile, impoverished Europeans, including victims of the Irish potato famine, Scottish farmers driven from their lands, and retired British officers, were making the journey across the Atlantic with dreams of a better life. Instead of the idyllic pastures advertised in Europe, settlers were met with untamed wilderness. It wouldn't be until the 1850s that colonization roads would be established, connecting communities through the bush and forever altering the Anishinaabes' traditional hunting grounds and way of life. Early settlers like David and Jane Fife would have had the difficult task of finding their plot, clearing the area, and constructing the small cabin before the winter set in. Round logs were used in haste. Without a sawmill, there was no way to plane the wood, and as it dried, cracks would form, letting in the cold. This would not have been a luxurious life at all. Luckily, the fifes had windows. Most of the time they would not, due to the difficulty of transporting glass. Food would need to be hung from the ceiling to protect it from mice and bugs. And because the settlers came with only the things they could carry, the few supplies given to them, and their own industriousness, they often relied on the expertise of the local Anishinaabe. When they were able, the Fife family of 5 would have cooked outside. Not only would cabin fever be an issue in the cramped quarters, the wooden structure itself would have been a fire hazard. Even with these hardships, in just a few decades, the Fife family was beginning to make a name for themselves. In the 1840s, David received a small sample of wheat from a friend in Scotland, having had terrible luck with the varieties common in Canada at the time. Just 3 heads survived the first planting. According to legend, David's wife, Jane, saved those last 3 heads of seeds from being eaten by a cow. After careful breeding, David had produced enough seed to share with his neighbors. By the end of the century, red Fife wheat had become the most common and successful wheat throughout much of North America. The ingenuity of David Fife and his family, along with other settlers in the area, helped forge a thriving farming community, a long way from the rustic homesteads which marked its inception. As the 1800s marched on, European settlers were finding ways to enrich their lives. Self-sustained communities sprouted up along rivers, where mills were built. Now settlers could have their wheat processed and sold in larger quantities. While mills became the utilitarian means for success, general stores became essential to the social well-being of communities. Essentials like tea, nails, and flowers could be bought in bulk, and farmers would take the time to exchange gossip and learn about the latest news. Farm produce, such as eggs and butter, might even be bartered for store goods. The benefits of a prospering community were reflected in the simple conveniences of a traditional home of the time. The Fitzpatrick house would have been a typical settler's second home, a stark improvement from the cramped quarters of the Fife cabin. A large stone hearth sits at the center of the home, providing warmth. Meals would have been prepared over the fire using pots and Dutch ovens. While the house was constructed with more care, temperatures would have dipped below 0 in the winter, with no option for heating the upper rooms. Michael and Susan Fitzpatrick would have taken turns sleeping through the night, a practice called segmented sleeping, in order to keep the fire going and complete small chores. Simple luxuries like textiles may have been purchased from local craftsmen or artisans. The S.W. Lowry Weaver Shop is an example of what a local tradesman's store might have looked like. Simple woven fabrics used for blankets, shawls, and rugs would have been constructed on different types of looms, which were operated manually by hand. The creation of the jacquard loom, which was not available in the region until later in the century, allowed for the execution of more intricate patterns using a set of perforated cards. From this early technology arose modern-day computer chips. Besides these few luxuries, the Fitzpatrick family would have made most things needed for daily life. Herbs were dried indoors and used for flavoring and medicines. Before getting married, the girls of the home would have tended to sewing, weaving, and quilt making for the family. It was a tranquil but difficult life. While settlers like the Fitzpatricks had left behind the hardships of early homesteading, their lives were driven by work and meeting their needs. Even so, the successes of Peterborough County farmers were beginning to catch the attention of the British monarchs.
In 1860, 18-year-old Albert Edward, Prince of Wales, made the 2-week-long journey from England, visiting various locations throughout Canada West and the United States. His ship landed in Coburg to a great reception. The leaders of the surrounding Mississauga communities greeted him with handmade gifts. Apparently, Prince Albert was so taken by the beauty of the area, he named it after Henry Longfellow's poem, The Song of Hiawatha, of which he was quite fond. This was entirely appropriate, as Longfellow's poem had been inspired in part by his encounter with Kagigagabo, he who stands forever, who was born in the Mississauga village at Rice Lake, the very location Prince Albert named. These moments of celebration and hard work marked the path towards Confederation. After Confederation, the newly formed Canadian government passed the Gradual Enfranchisement Act in 1869, and later the Indian Act in 1876. While settlers were establishing their lives and becoming more comfortable, the Mississauga were having to adapt to the imposition of these acts, along with the introduction of Indian agents. New Western methods of governance were undermining their traditions and politics, an impact still felt today.
By the late 1800s, families were beginning to enjoy some of the conveniences of the late Victorian era. The Milburn House is an example of a fixer-upper from the 1870s, at least according to the records left by Thomas and Sarah Milburn's daughter, who would have lived here at the time. Thomas Milburn and his wife Sarah would have added colorful wooden siding, manicured gardens, and a white picket fence, enhancing the curve appeal of their modern home. Now was a time when Canadians could start thinking about what they wanted and not just what they needed. 7 people would have lived here at one point, and while the rooms seemed small, they would have been filled with the trappings of a successful household. This parlor would have been saved for special occasions, decorated with a dark, luxurious wallpaper, a horsehair fainting couch, and various pieces of family art. During the 1800s, girls were taught how to be wives. Samplers were one way of instructing young girls on the art of cross-stitch, a kind of guide for future use once she had moved out of her parents' home and into her husband's. Off of the parlor is a room which might have been used as a sick room. Tight quarters meant illness could easily spread through a family. Settlers knew that sick individuals needed to be isolated to contain the spread of germs. Medical treatment was rare, and there were few doctors in the region. Families would either make their own medicines with herbs and plants from their gardens or purchase some from the general store. Medicine was highly unregulated. Opium, also known as laudanum, was often used in the treatment of many ailments. One of the benefits of modern farm life was a cast iron stove. This beautiful big stove would have heated both floors of the Milburn House, along with an additional stove in the parlor. This was the heart of the home, where the family would gather, and again we see the evidence of a successful farm. Coal oil lamps replaced flickering candles, and a cistern pump provided the convenience of accessing water indoors. Thomas Milburn would have benefited from new farming technologies as well. As yields grew bigger, so did the equipment needed to harvest them. A steam engine, similar to the later Sawyer-Massey steam engine model, would have been easily transported through a community to aid in farming endeavors.
As the world entered the 20th century, Canadians living in the region were greeted by both great success and difficulty. The Anishinaabe were faced with some of the greatest challenges. The Williams Treaties, signed in 1923, were meant to clear up previous treaties, including Treaty 20. However, they did not secure hunting and fishing rights for the First Nations involved. This has led to feelings of resentment, mistrust, and a deep sense of loss. However, since the earliest contact, the Mississauga have always advocated for their rights and petitioned the government to honor treaty agreements. Litigation was filed against the government in 1992 for fair compensation. A settlement was only reached in August of 2018, with apologies following in November that year. Indigenous peoples are resilient, and their culture, language, and spirituality are experiencing a resurgence that is strengthening Indigenous nations and Canada.
The past 200 years have been filled with struggles and triumphs. Our current accomplishments and efforts of reconciliation are built on the hard work, advocacy, and traditions of our ancestors, who live on through us. We can take the best of their natures while learning from their mistakes to effect change for a better world now and for future generations.